Pride is so universal we even know the look. You know, a slight head tilt and a little, not quite a smile. The smirk, I guess we call it. If I came up here and I were to preach, and the first thing I did was stand here and go, okay, that guy has an attitude problem, right? Or I make a great point and I go, you know, as I say, yeah, somebody's got a problem. It's that universal that every human being can discern in gesture when somebody is being proud. Wow, do we have to watch ourselves or not? That universal. Watching out. That's the whole thing with the Christian faith. We're told to keep from having our souls gutted by this thing called pride. We keep a watchful look on our inner self, but we're diligent in our faith in that we see what's going on and we look out for this thing called pride. Pride puts self in the center. There's the bottom of it. Somehow you are at the self. Yourself is at the center of the universe going on. Even in subtle ways, always in danger, always depending on circumstances and where we are in life, it can happen to anyone. It is a dangerous thing. So what are the consequences of this thing called pride? Well, just staying with Scripture, according to Scripture, consequences, Proverb 11:2 says the consequence of toxic pride is shame. It's shame. There is one thing you can count on. Well, this is an interesting thing. I found as I was looking at these Proverbs, it was one of those areas where it was worthwhile to look into the exact meaning of the words. When Solomon was writing this, when he wrote the word shame, was it what I think of shame? What would it mean in that ancient Hebrew he was talking about? And the word that he used means to reproof or to do a wicked thing, and the implication is towards God. Reproof or do a wicked thing. Shame is to have one's inflated bubble burst by the point of reality, that sharp point of reality. Reality can be brutal, can it? You have this bubble of who you think you are, and then reality comes along and goes, pop, guess what? You're not all that. You know, in circumstances. So shame brings that about. Shame shows you that you're not all you thought you were in the consequences of things. But the encouraging thing about shame, at least in the positive side, is one of the meanings being reproof. If a person has any wisdom at all, once they have been learned a hard lesson, they've been reproofed, they have been taught something, then maybe they'll learn. Problem is with pride, it tends to be blind to the lessons. It doesn't see it. Pride can take, when it is really taking hold, just blinds a person even to what's happening in reality. Proverbs 13:10 tells us pride only produces contention. Interesting word. Even in English, we had fun with that a bit when we have more discussion time in that first service. Is, okay, tell me, what's your thought? What? And when somebody says contention, what does that mean? And people share different aspects of what they thought contention means. Even more important, when Solomon was writing this down in Proverbs, what did he mean by the word contention in his language? In a more transliteral way, in the Hebrew it means adversary, controversy, or strife. Adversary, controversy, or strife. See, this starts to make sense. You see, if I stand here and I'm all about me, and it's important for me to be the person on top, the right one, the strongest one, the whatever one, and you're proud and we come together, only one of us can be the top dog. Contention can't help but happen. When I was looking and investigating into this word, because contention is one of those words that's, even in English, it's like, okay, if you really wanted to lock down a definition, what would you say? And so these things from Hebrew really helped. As I was looking at it, it made me think of something in my past where I was teaching a Bible study this many years ago on the East Coast. And in our church there were a few young fellows, young to mid-20s, and they were diligent in the studying of their scripture. They really made a point of trying to learn all they could. But the purpose was to go out and find some poor Mormon or Jehovah's Witness or something and just obliterate them with their logic. Good witnessing would be to go out and destroy someone else's argument. That's what it was all about. They even had a phrase, as we were starting class one day, I was kind of eavesdropping, they were talking about, and so said this, and I knew it was time to lock and load. I think, okay, there's a great approach to being a Christian witness. So, why would a person be that way? Pride. Pride can't help but bring contention. There came a little later in the story with these young fellows in church that they had made a little bit of a name for themselves, I guess, and they were at a board meeting, a church board meeting, and it must have been one of those epic meetings because I wasn't there, but I just heard of it later. When you hear of a board meeting afterwards, you know something big happened, and apparently whatever these young fellows were bringing up, I guess there were people just red-faced with anger, kind of in their face and them in theirs, and it just turned into the pastor was just his head in his hands type of thing, trying to control this. But that would fit Scripture. Scripture says when we are proud, it will lead to contention. It will lead to turmoil. It can't help but do that. Somewhere along the line, that's going to happen. I remember with Elder Steve talking about something, and he was dealing with somebody at one time. He said, I was agreeing with the guy, and he was still arguing. He said, pride does that. Pride brings contention. It can't help. It must be on top of everything. C.S. Lewis points out that pride is the only sin that is in direct competition with itself. Of even the 7 deadly sins, pride is the only sin in competition with itself. You can be gluttonous, but we could go out and be gluttonous together. We could be slothful, but we could be slothful together. But pride says only I can be on top. And it's direct competition. If you and I are both proud, we are automatically adversarial. It's just the way it's going to work with this type of pride. So it does. It can't help but bring contention. Proverbs 16:18 tells us that pride first leads to a fall and ultimately to destruction. To a fall and ultimately to destruction. Same thing. Is this what Solomon was trying to say? What did he mean by a fall? What did he mean by destruction? Well, the fall, if you transliterated the word from the Hebrew, literally means a tripping of the foot or stumbling. That's what happens with it. When we talked about gestures, that there's a posture to pride. There's a walk to pride too, isn't it? And in the first service, they nailed this one right away. If I were to ask you, what type of a walk is a proud walk, what word would you use? They got it, Deb. Same thing. And what does a strut look like, really, right? If you're thinking like them, it's kind of the head up. It's exaggerated. Someone said like kind of high stepping, like this. You're looking up, you can't look down, can you? And you can trip over something really easily. Everything about your footing is reckless in a strut. And of course, in a strut, especially in a strut, if you're all proud and then you trip and fall down, you look really silly. It's silly enough if you're just walking, but you look really silly when you're proud and you trip. That's the thing for comedians, right? Well, figuratively, the same thing is true mentally and such. You're going along your footing mentally, in your mentality is very reckless. You are not quite grounded in your footing. You're not in touch with reality. So even a little truth comes along and it trips you up and you look really silly. It's stumbling. And then what is the result of a bad stumble? A fall. And what is the result of a fall? Destruction. You can fall and really hurt yourself, even kill yourself. Destruction turned out to be a very telling word in the Hebrew as well, because it just didn't mean to be destroyed. It meant to be devastated as in a tempest. You get a mental picture with that? Devastated as in a tempest. When I was reading that, what it made me think of is those big wooden ships of old days that we get caught on the storms and then break up on a reef. The storm would just beat that ship, and those wooden planks would just be torn to pieces on the rocks of some reef somewhere. It was devastated by the storm. Well, we already know it makes sense because pride brings storms. It brings turmoil. It brings things like that epic board meeting where these young fellows eventually ended up in a red-faced fight with other Christians. This type of thing, pride can bring that. And then the devastation eventually, or the storm of that eventually devastates a person. It destroys the life. It hollows out the soul. Sometimes it's obvious. But the real scary part is often it is not. Often pride can be working disguised in some other form, and we can come across as being pious or coming across even as humble and such. And as we're doing this, it turns out it's really pride, and we're really thinking a lot of self and not God. A lot of self is in there. And it ends up, these things happen to us. It can't help but happen. The power of pride leads to storms, to contention, leads to disunity, leads to all of these things that we talked about, or all the things Solomon talked about. So I thought, okay, compiling from different sources and tests, looking at this, how proud are we? Or do we have a problem with pride? We can take a little test. This is the compilation. Kind of got a kick out of this enough that I even left it in the guide sheet so you could look at it later. And if you're not proud, you can be proud of that. So, well, let's see how we're doing. Question 1, or test 1 on this. Your main impression of hearing a message like this, you wish so-and-so was here to hear it. Because it really doesn't apply to you. Test 2, your spouse or coworkers have a problem with you, but it's only because they're jealous. 3, you are having trouble with your children, but it's only because they are ungrateful. 4, you readily admit you have some, quote, flaws, but it's only because, fill in your own excuse there. 5, you admit that you are that in some areas in your life that they're not going that well, but it's mainly because of this situation or because of this person. It certainly isn't your fault. 6, the church, your work, your family, etc. Those people are really in trouble if they don't take my point of view, and it's even worth bending a few morals to get that point of view accepted. 7, you deserve to be taken more seriously. 8, even though you hear challenges in a sermon like this or by some other biblical source, you don't change anything because really you're just fine the way you are. 9, one of your top peeves is people who are proud. 10, these questions make you feel a little convicted, but your inner response really is, well, other people are worse. How did you do with it? I failed. I'll tell you what, it can be so deceptive. But what makes pride so deadly? What's the secret behind the power of pride? Psalms 10:4 says, the wicked in his proud countenance does not seek God. God is in none of his thoughts. It's the thing. Pride is all about being filled with yourself. In some way, you are concentrated on yourself. And if you're filled with yourself, you can't be filled with God. It's just like basic physics. You take a cup, it can only be filled with one substance at a time, one or the other. And we need to understand what it can do if it gets a hold of us. Pride. first of the deadly seven, the worst of the deadly seven.